Danny Hurley isn't content with just 2 straight national titles, but is the law firm of Mahaney and McNeeley enough to bring him a three-peat?
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, folks? Welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, a daily national college hoop show, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host, Andy Patton, and you are joining at the place to get your college basketball content every single day. I want to thank all of you who have made this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. And of course, give a special shout out to those everyday listeners and those of you who have joined us on our Discord channel. If you have not done so yet, there is a link in the show notes. It is free to join. Come hang out with us talking college basketball 24/7. Today's episode is brought to you all by FanDuel. Folks, make every moment more. Right now, new customers will get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150 win or lose. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started. Well, on today's show, we got some coverage of UConn's 2 new additions. We got a look at Creighton's replacement for Trey Alexander, and we're closing out the show talking about Arizona State landing their highest rated recruit in program history. Danny Hurley is not the only member of the Hurley family that is cooking right now, but we are going to start with Danny's team. And a pair of additions, 1 recruit and 1 transfer, which seems right now to have basically closed out UConn's roster for the upcoming season, barring a surprise decision. I guess maybe it's not a surprise, barring a decision by Alex Karaban to stay in the NBA draft process. If that were to happen, they would likely have another addition on the way. But right now, UConn made the big addition over the weekend. Aidan Mahaney has committed to Storrs, Connecticut to join Danny Hurley's team. He is the St. Mary's transfer guard, spent the last 2 years in Moraga, California, playing for Randy Bennett. It was a bit of a surprise to see Mahaney even enter the transfer portal. He's from like 5 minutes from St. Mary's campus, something like really close to where St. Mary's is located. He was a regional kid. He loved St. Mary's growing up. He got recruited early on by Randy Bennett and by associate head coach Justin Joyner, and came to St. Mary's, immediately thrived as a freshman, kind of didn't really build much on his sophomore year. His numbers were kind of the same. In fact, in some ways, he was actually a bit worse as a sophomore than he was as a freshman, but kind of felt like your prototypical 4-year St. Mary's guard, similar to Emmett Nahr and Joe Rayhan and Jordan Ford and these other guys who've been prolific players for Randy Bennett's team over the past 20 years. But after 2 years, suddenly Aidan Mahaney enters the transfer portal. The projection for many right away was that he was going to go follow his associate head coach, Justin Joyner, who had taken the job as an associate head coach at Michigan under Dusty May. Many felt that that's where Mahaney was going to end up, but he never even visited at Michigan. He took visits to Creighton. He took visits to Virginia. He took a visit to Kentucky. And of course, he took a visit to UConn, ultimately ended up signing with Danny Hurley's team. Mahaney averaged 13.9 points in each of his first 2 seasons at St. Mary's. He averaged 2.6 rebounds and 2.6 assists last year for the Gales. And what I said about the efficiency numbers, here's kind of the example. And here's my reasoning for being skeptical. I don't want to say that I think this isn't going to work. I will say that people who are thinking that Aidan Mahaney joining UConn just pretty much solidifies that UConn is now in contention for a three-peat. I don't think it's that level of addition for Danny Hurley's team. I don't. He's a good player. I don't think that he pushes them to that level necessarily. We will talk about Liam McNeeley in a second, who certainly also helps push them a little bit forward. But for me, for Mahaney, when he became a more volume shooter, the efficiency dropped pretty significantly. And we're talking about a 2-year sample size, so it's, you got to take it with a bit of a grain of salt. But as a freshman, Aidan Mahaney took 5.3 3-point attempts per game, and he knocked them down at a very good 40% clip. As a sophomore last year, he went from 5.3 attempts per game all the way up to 6.9 attempts per game. That's a pretty big jump. And the percentage dropped fairly significantly. He went down to 35.5%. Now, 35.5% three-point shooter on 7 attempts per game, it's not bad, but it's also not great. It's not elite. It's good, but it's not elite. And I think if you look at Mahaney's career total and you see that he's like a 37 whatever percent three-point shooter, you're like, oh, wow, that's great. But he wasn't that last year. And I think that is the area of like, if you're going to get a guy who's going to take 7.5 3-pointers per game as a floor spacer alongside Caravan and McNeeley and all that, and he's knocking them down 35% of the time, again, it's not bad, but it's not exactly the elite level of shooting that I think, if you're UConn and they, which they just said shortly before I hit the record button here, that they are no longer pursuing Kobe Brea because they've added Aidan Mahaney. Kobe Brea is a better three-point shooter than Aidan Mahaney by a lot. And he's probably going to be a better three-point shooter next year at what I'm assuming will be Kentucky or maybe somewhere like North Carolina. But Mahaney is a good three-point shooter, but he's not a great three-point shooter. And I'm not sure you're looking at him as your Cam Spencer replacement. Like, he's just not quite on that level up to this point. That doesn't mean he can't take a leap. That doesn't mean his junior year won't be better than his freshman and sophomore years were at St. Mary's, and that he will be that kind of player that they need him to be. He's very capable of being that. I just think that right now he has to prove that he can take that step because, quite frankly, his performance from his freshman year to his sophomore year trended in the wrong direction. I want to talk a little bit about Liam McNeeley, the other newcomer joining the UConn Huskies. McNeeley's a 6'7" forward from Richardson, Texas. He played at Montverde Academy in Florida in his high school career. He's the number 11 ranked player in the 2024 recruiting class, according to On3's composite rankings. He had previously committed to Indiana, but he chose to decommit on March 8th and has now committed to the Huskies on April 26th. Also a great shooter. So again, for UConn, you're not only adding Aidan Mahaney, you are also adding Liam McNeeley, who is expected to be an impact shooter right away for the Huskies. He's a movement shooter. He's also a standstill shooter. He's got some good pick and roll aspects to his game, moves well without the basketball, reads defense as well. Not just a pure shooter prospect. He's got a little bit more to his game than that. And so if you're looking at UConn right now, you add Aidan Mahaney, who's going to be a veteran guy, going to probably step into a starting role. Liam McNeeley comes in, probably also going to step into a starting role at that small forward position. Again, some of this depends a little bit on what happens with Alex Caravan. But McNeeley is joining a class that already includes two other four-star talents. That's Amon Noel, a 6-foot point guard who's ranked 31st in the recruiting class, as well as Isaiah Abraham, a 6'7" forward who is ranked 82nd. And right now, again, there's an indication that UConn's probably not really looking to do a whole lot more. If Alex Caravan comes back, this is a look at the likely rotation lineup that we're going to see from the UConn Huskies this upcoming season. Terrace Reed going to step into that starting role at the center spot, vacated by Donovan Clingan. Terrace Reed, a transfer from Michigan. Alex Caravan will play that small ball 4 role once again, assuming he comes back. I think Liam McNeeley probably steps into that starting role at the 3. And then you have your two guards are going to be Hassan Diarra, who was the Big East 6th man of the year last year, and then Aidan Mahaney. And then coming off the bench, a couple returnees in Samson Johnson, who looked great in a small role last year. He's maybe not exactly like Donovan Clingan, who was phenomenal in a backup role, but he's going to be very quality in that role again. You have Solomon Ball, who played some big minutes last year, especially when Stephon Castle was hurt. And then you have the two freshmen, Noel and Abraham. That's a really quality team. I don't know if it's on the same level of the previous 2 national championship teams, but it's going to be a tough out in the Big East. And certainly if players take leaps, if McNeeley is one of the best freshmen in college basketball this season, if Mahaney can kind of take the type of leap that Cam Spencer did when he came to UConn from Rutgers, if Hassan Diarra can take a big leap, you probably need pretty much all of these things to happen in order for UConn to be a legitimate threat to be a 3-time national, back-to-back national champion. You also need Terrace Reed to kind of seamlessly adapt to Danny Hurley's offense at the center position. But while I'm saying like, oh, all these things need to happen, they could. It's not like it's out of the question that these players could take a leap and that the guys who were off the bench last year who are stepping into bigger roles are going to be able to do that. Like that's what happened last year with guys like Clingan and Caravan, who took on a bigger role, and others who did the same. Like it's more than possible for a team that's as well coached as UConn is, for a team that, for Danny Hurley, who's trying to find the pieces that he thinks are going to fit the best. Like there's a real possibility that this works for UConn, but I'm a little bit more skeptical than I think a lot of others are right now. But certainly it's hard to complain about adding Mahaney and McNeeley to a team that already had some good pieces around them. Well, UConn's biggest competition in the Big East has been the Creighton Blue Jays, and they added some pop to their lineup over the weekend. We're going to get to that in just a second. Right after I tell you that today's episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you by Game Time. Folks, the weather is starting to heat up across the country, and that means it's time to go take in some Major League Baseball games. And I got great news. Game Time is now an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app, folks, they actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. So with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. One of my favorite features on Game Time is their last-minute deals. Maybe you want to get tickets on an NBA playoff game. You can save up to 60% off buying last-minute tickets for not only sporting events, but for concerts, comedy, theater, and more. And I often worry about my tickets being bogus and trying to get into a game with a fake ticket that I bought online. But thankfully, Game Time's ticket coverage is covered by the most flexible customer service policy in the entire ticketing industry. And I love having that peace of mind. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app now, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Terms apply. Download the Game Time app today. Last-minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. Today's episode of Locked On College Basketball is also brought to you by FanDuel. Folks, it is playoff time in both the NBA and NHL. Baseball is in full swing, and FanDuel is your place to bet on every single game. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150 win or lose. So bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks, all on an app that is safe, secure, and super easy to use. Folks, UConn currently has plus 1,100 odds to repeat again and secure that three-peat. They're only behind Kansas, who has plus 1,000 odds right now. So if you are interested, if you think, man, Aidan Mahaney is the dude they need to take that team back to a three-peat, then what are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet an automatic W. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On College Basketball Podcast. And we're still talking about the Big East Conference, moving away from talking about the UConn Huskies and their addition of Aidan Mahaney and freshman Liam McNeeley. And we are instead talking about the Creighton Blue Jays, who are looking to stay competitive with UConn and Marquette, who has some losses of their own with Oso Ighodaro and Tyler Kolek out the door. But for Creighton, they got to replace Trey Alexander, who is declared for the NBA draft and said he's not planning to come back. We know Baylor Shireman is out the door and out of eligibility. Francisco Farabello, who's coming off the bench last year, he's gone. And so Greg McDermott's like, what do I need to do to put together a competitive roster that's going to stay in that top 3 conversation in the Big East? And he made his first really big move of the offseason, securing a transfer portal addition in Pop Isaacs, 6'2" guard out of Texas Tech. Isaacs is going to be a junior next year. He's got 2 years of eligibility remaining. He was very good as a freshman, but was even better as a sophomore this past year for the Red Raiders, finishing the season averaging just under 16 points per game, as well as 3.5 assists, 3.2 rebounds, and 1 steal per game. Not a particularly efficient scorer, although I suspect that could change in a different offensive setting. I was about 41% on 2-pointers and just under 30% from 3, despite taking over 7 per game. Just didn't knock him down at a particularly efficient clip. However, he was much more efficient as a freshman. He was a better 2-point shooter, better free throw shooter, and a much, much better 3-point shooter as a freshman, was 37.8%. Dropped nearly 10 percentage points from his freshman year to his sophomore year. Interestingly, a similar conversation that we had with Aidan Mahaney, although it was a much smaller decrease for Isaacs. That is the question. Does Creighton's offense open it up enough to the point where he can get back to being a more efficient 3-point shooter? Somewhat similar to the conversation we could end up having with Aidan Mahaney. Does UConn's offense open it up enough that he becomes a more effective shooter? But this is a important addition for Creighton because Isaacs is a go-to scoring type. He's a guy who can really run the offense, facilitate things. He's going to partner in that backcourt with Stephen Ashworth, who is a knockdown, lights out, knock him down 3-point shooter. Maybe that takes a little pressure off Isaacs, where he can be more of a guy driving to the basket, facilitating the offense, not necessarily needing to take 7 3-point attempts per game. Maybe that helps him have a more efficient time because he's not being relied on to score as often. I think that could really work out with Ashworth and Isaacs in that backcourt for the Creighton Blue Jays. And then kind kind of moving into that Baylor Shireman role. At least the hope for Greg McDermott's team is that the guy who's going to take on that spot is Jamiya Neal, transfer from Arizona State. He's a rising senior. He's got 1 year of eligibility left. 6'6" wing who averaged 11 points, 5.5 boards, about 2 assists, and about 1 steal per game last year for the Sun Devils. Was 52.5% on 2-pointers, but similarly was not a particularly effective 3-point shooter as well. So not a lot of shooting joining this Creighton Blue Jays team. But again, Stephen Ashworth can handle a big chunk of that role. And really this team needed to replace Baylor Shireman. They needed to replace Trey Alexander. And they found a couple of guys who are absolutely going to be able to do that in Jamiya Neal and Pop Isaacs. The big question really for this team right now is Ryan Kalkbrenner, because the deadline to declare for the NBA draft has passed. But last year, Ryan Kalkbrenner did in fact declare for the NBA draft, but there was no announcement made. He made an announcement when he decided to return to school and not stay in the NBA draft process, but he didn't make an announcement that he was declaring for the NBA draft. So while that deadline has passed, it's possible Ryan Kalkbrenner has in fact declared for the NBA draft. What we do know is he has not declared for the transfer portal. As of recording this right now, it is the 29th of April. He has a couple days to make up his mind. May 1st is the transfer portal deadline. If Ryan Kalkbrenner is not in the transfer portal by May 1st, he's either coming back to Creighton or he sneakily declared for the NBA draft and is going to go that direction. More than likely, if he doesn't enter the transfer portal by May 1st, he is going to be back with the Creighton Blue Jays next season. But that's the big hinge for this roster right now. They had two of them. It was Trey Alexander and Ryan Kalkbrenner. It was very hard, I imagine, for Coach McDermott and for Creighton fans to just be like, what is it going to look like next year? Because if both these guys come back, we're in pretty good shape. If neither of these guys come back, we're in a world of pain. And right now, we know definitively that one of them is not coming back. The expectation right now is that Ryan Kalkbrenner is, but we don't know for sure. So trying to look at what this roster is going to look like is a little bit more difficult. You got to feel pretty good about adding Pop Isaacs. Talented kid, 2 years of eligibility left. Anybody who can score 16 points per game in the Big 12 is a dang good basketball player. And getting him onto your roster is a really good addition. Jamiya Neal, 11 points per game in the Pac-12 with Arizona State. That's a quality addition as well. He's big, he's bulky, he's a good rebounder. Not a great shooter, but I think you're going to find ways to kind of work around that if you're this Creighton team. Right now, you're looking at a lineup that's probably going to be Ryan Kalkbrenner, Mason Miller, Jamiya Neal, Stephen Ashworth, and Pop Isaacs. But there is a depth concern beyond that, because they lost some guys to the transfer portal, and frankly, they weren't a particularly deep team last year anyway. They do have 3 incoming freshmen, 2 4-stars in Jackson McAndrew, 4-star power forward who's 38th in the 2024 class, as well as Larry Johnson, a 4-star combo guard who is 64th in the class, and then Ty Davis, friend of the program, actually came on the show last year before he committed to Creighton. He's going to join the Blue Jays as a 3-star shooting guard ranked 190th in the class. So Creighton's still got some work to do. Still got some roster construction that needs to be done. But as of right now, you got to feel good about Pop Isaacs. You got to feel good about Jamiya Neal. If Ryan Kalkbrenner comes back, this team's going to be right in the thick of things. They're going to be right with UConn. They're going to be right with Marquette, right with what might be a very good St. John's teams next year. If they can continue to make some moves in the portal, we'll see what that looks like. But I think Pop Isaacs feels like a really good Creighton Blue Jays type player, and I think he's going to adjust very seamlessly to that team. And if they get Ryan Kalkbrenner back, this is going to be another one of the best teams in college basketball next year. Well, we're switching away from the Big East, but we're staying in the Hurley family because Bobby Hurley just landed Arizona State's highest-rated recruit ever in Jayden Quaintance. What does it mean for them as they move into the Big 12? We're going to get to that in just a second. Right after I tell you that today's episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you by Monopoly Go. All right, folks, game off. We got to pause here to talk about Monopoly Go. I know what you're saying, flag on the play. You already talked about that, but there is so much good stuff in this game. In Monopoly Go, you can team up with friends for time tournaments where you work together to build up each other's boards. The more you win together, the more awesome prizes you unlock. And there is so many different things you can get, like unique stickers you can trade with friends to complete albums for big prizes, cool new playing pieces to travel the boards with, hilarious emojis for taunting friends when you smash their buildings or heist their vaults. Plus, Monopoly Go feels new and exciting every single day with constantly changing tournaments and challenges. A ton include their own unique mini games like digging for treasure or a robot pachinko machine. And there's always new timed events that help you win big, like massive multipliers for everything you win or rent frenzies. There's always something fun to discover in Monopoly Go. So get off the bench and go download it now, free on the Google Play Store or the Apple App Store. Game on. All right, folks, closing out the show today, talking about Arizona State, the Sun Devils, Bobby Hurley's team. We talked a bit about Jamiya Neal transferring to Creighton, but we are here to talk about additions for Bobby Hurley and the Sun Devils, namely the highest rated recruit in Arizona State basketball history, a program that has had some prolific players in the past. The highest rated recruit in the school history is now Jayden Quaintance, the number 8 ranked player in the 2024 recruiting class at 24/7 Sports. You've probably heard about Quaintance. He is a former Kentucky commit. Like all of the former Kentucky commits outside of Travis Perry, he has decommitted from Kentucky following John Calipari's decision to move to Arkansas and Kentucky's decision to hire Mark Pope. Except while many of those guys, like Carter Knox, like Billy Richmond, like Boogie Fland, all ended up following Calipari to Arkansas, Quaintance went a different direction. He considered Arkansas. He reportedly considered a return to Kentucky, but he also was considering Louisville. Pat Kelsey, who's made a lot of really great additions in the transfer portal so far and some big-time recruits coming in. He was also considering Memphis. Penny Hardaway has pulled some really big-time recruits in the past, so not a surprise to see them in the mix here. But then we got word that Quaintance was going to Arizona State, was visiting with Bobby Hurley and the Sun Devils. And my rule of thumb is if a school seems to stand out in kind of a unique way when looking at the rest of the schools on the list, often that means that's where they're going. It's happened many times. If you see a list of 4 or 5 programs and 3 or 4 of them are like the kind of programs you'd expect, and then one of them stands out a little bit, usually do some digging as to why or figure out what the situation is, because oftentimes that's going to be the place that they end up going. Quaintance goes to Tempe, visits at Arizona State, and boom, decides to commit. He is now going to be, again, the highest ranked recruit in program history. For those of you who don't know a little bit about him, want to know a little bit about him, he's 17 years old. He's 6'9", but he's got a ridiculous 7'3" wingspan. He's long. He's insanely athletic. He's super young, folks. He's not even draft eligible until 2026. He has to spend 2 years in college, or at least 2 years not in the NBA, whether he goes the professional route overseas. The G League Ignite doesn't exist anymore, so he hasn't got that option. He in theory, could spend 2 years at Arizona State. He could, of course, enter the transfer portal after this year if he wanted to do that. But right now, if you're Bobby Hurley, you land a top 10 player in this class, a kid who many people think has top 5 NBA draft upside, like legitimate superstar potential, and he's so young. And you bring him in along with what's already been a very good recruiting class for this program. Quaintance is obviously the big prize. Top 10 prospect, 5-star, all that good stuff. But he joins a pair of 4-stars and a pair of 3-star recruits who are going to join this program as freshmen next year, including Amir Ali. He's a 4-star small forward, 85th in the class. Sami Yane, who's a 4-star power forward in this class. He's number 89. Your 2 3-stars are Bo Aldridge, a shooting guard who's ranked 189th, and center Jaden Smith, who's ranked 246th. So you got 5 freshmen coming in, all who are going to compete for playing time right away. You also got Adam Miller back in the mix. This was announced on Monday as well. So not only do you find out you're getting Quaintance, you're also going to get one of your best players from the last season back in the mix. Miller started his career at Illinois, played at LSU as a sophomore, played last year at Arizona State. Now he's coming back, averaged 12 points per game in 23 games last year. He didn't start the season playing because he was one of those players who didn't have a waiver to play as a 2-time transfer until there was a rule change, or I guess a law basically that said, hey, all 2-time transfers are immediately eligible. He became eligible after that. Like I said, averaged 12 points per game for them for the rest of the season. Now, if you're Bobby Hurley in Arizona State, or if you're an Arizona State fan listening to the show, you got 5 transfers coming in, 5 freshmen coming in. You got a big-time returnee in Adam Miller, but 10 players from your team enter the transfer portal. There is a lot of loss on this program as well. Frankie Collins is the most notable by far. He goes to TCU, started at Michigan, spent the last 2 years playing for Arizona State. Last year averaged about 14 points, 4.5 boards, 3.2 assists, and 2.6 steals per game. Jose Perez has graduated after playing for Arizona State last year. He averaged 13.5 points per game. Jamiya Neal, who we mentioned earlier, averaged 11 points per game. So basically all of your leading scorers outside of Adam Miller are out the door. But there is good news. Not just Jayden Quaintance, good news. This team has also made some significant additions in the transfer portal. They bring in BJ Freeman from Milwaukee, Austin Nunez from Ole Miss, Alston Mason from Missouri State, Bashir Jihad from Ball State, very productive player for Ball State. All those guys coming in alongside Miller, alongside the freshmen. It's an exciting time. It's an exciting time to be an Arizona State fan, a basketball fan, Bobby Hurley fan, whatever it may be. Here's the thing, though. Here's the thing. This team's about to go to the Big 12. And folks, the Big 12 looks like it's going to be unbelievably competitive next year. Is the roster as currently constructed for Bobby Hurley good enough to compete in the Big 12? Probably not. And that's not even a knock on the roster. It's really not. Right now, here are the top 5 teams. One of these teams is going to finish 5th in the Big 12 next year. Kansas, Houston, Baylor, Iowa State, Arizona. You could make a legitimate argument that that should be your top 5 teams in college basketball next year. I would probably push back on Arizona right now with the way their roster is currently constructed, but literally the 4 of those other teams definitely have a strong argument to be top 5 teams in college basketball, and they're all in the same conference. And Arizona's in that conference too. That's your top 5. Outside of that, BYU went to the tournament last year. So did Texas Tech. So did TCU. So did Colorado, who is now in the Big 12. So that's 9 teams right there, all who went to the NCAA tournament last year, all coming back in the Big 12. Most of them who have at least kept up with their roster. BYU's obviously had a lot of turnover. That's going to be tough for them. Colorado's lost a lot of key players with Tristan Da Silva declaring for the NBA draft today. That's tough for them. TCU's had some losses as well, but all these teams they're going to replenish as they typically do. Outside of that, you got Kansas State and Cincinnati. Cincinnati brings almost everybody back from a team that had a decent argument to be an at-large consideration last year. Kansas State has made some huge additions already. Doug McDaniel from Michigan is a very big-time addition for Jerome Tang and the Wildcats, so they're going to be back in the thick of things as well. All those teams right now, even with this additions for Arizona State, even with Quaintance coming in, all those teams right now, in my mind, are pretty considerably ahead of Arizona State. I'm not trying to pour cold water on what's been an exciting day for the Sun Devils. It's just a reality of moving to the Big 12 Conference. You also have Utah, West Virginia, Oklahoma State, and Central Florida. Arizona State can probably be the top of that group, but again, that puts you 10th in the Big 12. Can they compete for higher than that? I think yes, they can, but I'm not right now definitively having them over any of those other teams. That's just the nature of being in the Big 12. You might have a really good team, and that might be maybe good enough to finish 9th in the Big 12. Granted, 9th place team in the Pac-12 was not sniffing the NCAA tournament. 9th place team in the Big 12, yeah, you are. So it might still be a better spot for Arizona State, even if they're going to finish a lot lower in the standings than they would have in the Pac-12 conference. It's going to wrap it up for us today here on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast. Thank you so much to those of you who have made this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. My co-host Isaac Shade and friend of the program Leaf Tulane will be back with you all on Wednesday, and then we're going to get you ready for the final day of the transfer portal being open, all the chaos and craziness that might hit us on that last day, and then we'll get you ready for the rest of the offseason after that. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, as always, peace out.